Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you with us. And what a fun week 5. More teams lost, so we'll have stuff to talk about as their survivor status is now in question. And we've got votes to take and to, take a look at a couple of games that are coming up this week in the second half of the show. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. If you can, take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. We always appreciate it. But Sean, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Sorry that we only have one show this week. Unfortunately, we had a family situation, and so we're rolling with one this week. But I think we'll have a good action-packed show this week to make up for it. But other than that, doing great. I mean, look, we didn't get a chance to talk about it on an early show. How about the Alabama-Georgia game? It turns out that, in fact, the regular season in college football is not broken, that actually we're doing pretty okay.
I 100% agree, because this is, first of all, it was one of those games where you watch the two competitors and you're like, I kind of want to see both of these teams get a shot later on. And they're going to get a shot, especially with the 12-team playoff. I mean, unless the wheels totally come off one of those programs, which is doubtful, we're going to get a chance to see both of them get a chance to fight for a bite of the apple, especially come the end of the season. And as people have said, maybe this is the first of 3 meetings. Who knows? Quite possible. So again, I actually, in a way, maybe it's a bit not the worst week to have only one show, because this week we're going to be talking in the second half of the show about some of the upcoming games, but it is a pretty dry weekend. We talked about that. I mean, we were just before the show, we were saying, man, remember Clemson at Florida State? Boy, that sounded like it was going to be a great game before the season. And the luster has sort of come off of that one. But, first we're going to go through and talk about the teams we have in our survivor pool, because we are the College Football Survivor Show. Just as a quick reminder, our format's pretty simple. There are 12 teams, and we can only have a maximum of 12 teams. We vote off at least one team each week. We can vote off more than one. And even if all 12 teams win in a given week, we still have to pick somebody to kick off the island. So then we start looking a little bit closer at how they perform. Not a problem this week. Let's just say that. After we vote teams off, we can vote teams back on, but we're not required to, except for some new rules we created this season with the 12-team playoff, with the seeding, and with the top 5 conference champions getting into the playoff. We will always have a team in our 12 that is a member of each of the P4 conferences. So obviously the Big 10, SEC, Big 12, ACC, and we're going to have one member of the G5. So if any one of those teams gets kicked off, we have to replace them with an equivalent, unless there are other teams. Like right now we have 2 ACC teams, but only one Big 12 team. So if we remove the Big 12 team, we have to replace it with another Big 12 team. And we've kind of tweaked it a little bit. We can't just pile on the G5 team. The G5 team, if it's the only one removed, we still have to remove one of the other, presumably 11 P4 teams. I mean, there's still a chance that you can get 2 G5 in there. I mean, the more I've been thinking about it, we'll get to that point, but who knows? Maybe one of these G5 teams can rise into the top 10 and not just be or I guess it would have to be 2 conference champs at that point, but we'll see. Well, that's a whole other conversation for another day. So heading into this past weekend, our list was Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, Ole Miss, Penn State, Utah as a Big 12, the only Big 12 representative, Miami and Clemson, both ACC, Missouri, Tennessee, and our G5 was Boise State, which we chatted about a little bit because we were thinking about UNLV, and then UNLV, my goodness, they had a whole side story. Like this past week for UNLV, and most teams don't have a week like that, let alone who knew that the all of college football for a moment would turn to them before we had a game with Alabama and Georgia. But all of that said, what did you think of this week's slate? I mean, this past weekend slate and how that shaped up?
Well, let's touch on UNLV for a second. The funny thing about, like you mentioned, the idea of 2 group of 5 teams having a chance there, the issue is that the two best of them, in my opinion at least, are both from the Mountain West. You have a ranked Boise State, you have a ranked UNLV. I made the case for UNLV to be the team to make the field last week, but at the same time, like, I can't say that I feel good about kicking out Boise State with the way that they're playing right now and with their running back Ashton Ginty looking like. I actually got asked on the radio before this, when is the last time that there's been a running back this good overall in college football? And like, so I brought up like, Jonathan Taylor, obviously at Wisconsin, was one who came to mind. But like, I feel like you might have to go back to like Christian McCaffrey at Stanford back in 2016. Like, it's what they are doing right now. What Ashton Ginty right now is doing at the running back position is pretty absurd, just with the complete game that he's playing. But I think that you can make a really good case that UNLV as a complete team is playing as well as anybody right now. And they play a game this week, of course, against Syracuse. If they win that game, they're 3-0 against power conference opponents. It's crazy what's happening right now.
I do have to say this last week is like watching one of those ESPN like likelihood of victory things for the UNLV's chances, because right after we recorded the show that night is the whole Sluka drama came off. So suddenly a lot of people are like, oh, their chances just plummeted. But then we watched kind of the back and forth. It was really ugly. I'm not even going to get into who I think was right or wrong there. But then they're like, well, Hajj Malik Williams, he's supposed to be a great guy. He came from Campbell, he was a multi-year starter there. And then we saw how they actually performed. And not only were they good, but they actually got the passing game again, because, Sluka, for his strengths, was not a great passer. He was only like 40-something% passing rate. So suddenly you see that great wide receiver they have, Ricky White.
Ricky White the third, yeah.
Suddenly take off again. I love he was like, hey, Circa CEO, do you want to give that $100,000 to our offensive line? Deep respect there. Deep respect there.
The thing that's going to be funny about this whole situation is that if Matthew Sluka felt like he was promised something, because we didn't talk about this on last week's show, so I just want to touch on it. If Matthew Sluka feels like he was promised something and they did not deliver, I get it. Don't get me wrong, I get it. At the same time, I don't think that it's like, this is one of the things about the transfer portal and NIL too, which is that like nobody feels loyalty to you on your team either, right? Like, yeah. Ricky White wasn't sitting here trying to stand up for anybody either, and look, it's not his job to do that necessarily, but it just made for a really bizarre situation. But what a testament to what they brought in. I know that Barry Odom had mentioned before, we feel like we have 3 quarterbacks that we can win with. It turns out he was absolutely right about that. So it's been definitely a fun start in the Mountain West, especially. To touch on some other games though, actually, to go ahead and start talking about some of the teams that we might have an opportunity to kick off. We'll get to Alabama, Georgia. We will definitely have a conversation about Georgia. I feel pretty okay that they're not going to be kicked off, but we will have the conversation. What exactly happened in Kentucky Ole Miss? Because this was an Ole Miss team that we knew had yet to face real major competition, but it was one who had been incredibly dominant. They ended up actually finishing with more total yards than Kentucky in this game. But like, they just did not look ready for the moment in so many ways going against a Mark Stoops coach team.
Yeah, it is remarkable. But we also have to remember how they did against Georgia. That game, a lot of people were giving Georgia credit and saying like, yeah, they were a little bit surprised there, but it seems like Kentucky's defense came to play and really figured out a way to control. And we even talked about that. We're like, well, let's see how Alabama learns from it. And for the first half, we were like, oh, and we'll get to that game obviously a little bit later. But yeah, I just think, and here's the problem. Ole Miss, we were talking about them before the season, how well, obviously the transfer portal king, lots of great talent on the ball. But the question was it enough? Would you fill in enough holes, but at the same time, would the entire talent level be able to maintain itself? And here I wonder, is this a coaching issue? Is this really, because we've always said Lane Kiffin can put together a great team and he can certainly usually coach a good offense. And of course, we know as a head coach, you don't necessarily get quite as in the weeds as you were, like, let's say when he was at Alabama. But my gosh, what do you think? He just can't get the team to play at the level they need to? Because it's always and to be clear, let me step back. Usually it always happens against the marquee opponents. Usually then Ole Miss will talk some crap before they play Alabama, and Nick Saban kind of like grumble, and then they would just suffer a beatdown. This is against Kentucky, which, again, I still want to say it's the early half of the season. Kentucky could end up being exceptional, and by the end of the season, we're actually talking maybe, who knows, they're in the at-large conversation, although I doubt it. But we never know. Is this how much of this is Ole Miss messing up, and how much of this are we just underplaying Kentucky?
Well, I do think that Kentucky does some very particular things well, which is they are especially good at stopping the run. And I think that the big warning sign for me coming out of this game is Ole Miss has been an efficient running team all year through the first couple games of the year. But this was their first real test, trying to run the ball against a good opponent. It was Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern before that, and they had a 100-yard rusher in 2 of the last 3 games. Against Kentucky, they were under 3 yards per carry. And I think that that's a huge deal for the way that they want to structure their team. They've actually been a team that's run the ball better over the past couple of years of the Lane Kiffin era than pass the ball. And so even I think you look at this game, like Trey Harris, their star wide receiver, kind of bailed them out at times. I believe he had a breakaway touchdown, a 48-yard pass in the third quarter. This was not a team that was having a lot of success down to down. And, Kentucky is a team that's very comfortable playing in the mud. We saw this against Georgia. Look, it's ironic, but it's kind of true. Like, Mark Stoops is from the Iowa tree, and you see that sort of thing come to fruition in games like this. But 1 for 10 on third down, 14 first downs to 22 for Kentucky. Like, I don't know. It's just, I think that's management.
Are we seeing what Texas A&M was seeing in Mark Stoops? Is that what we're seeing here? Because that was that whole offseason coverage. Because after they lost to South Carolina, we're like, ooh, man, yeah, maybe Texas A&M made the right call, especially a lot of because it was a whole, we don't have to belabor that. But now I'm like, you know what? The guy can coach. After that Georgia game where everyone's like, ooh, he nearly did it. And then against Ole Miss, now suddenly, if I'm Mark Stoops, I'm absolutely savoring this. I hope he gets a chance to kind of like every season where the Wildcats do finish a little bit higher than the Aggies in the SEC. You can just the amount of Schadenfreude that's going to be there and the amount of writing that's going to be on that particular topic. But
so I will say so. I am voting to kick them out. They can get back soon. Right? Like, they play at South Carolina. I think that's going to be a good test for them. South Carolina is a better pass rush team than they are necessarily a run stuffing team. But if they struggle to run the ball against South Carolina, that's a huge warning sign for me. Even that Oklahoma game, they're probably not going to lose it, but like, it's another one where if they run the ball well, I think that'll tell us something about the team. But here's the reality too, is that this was in so many ways supposed to be kind of a straight shot to the college football playoff. They played, quote unquote, one real game, that Georgia game on November 9th, Ole Miss did. To lose one this early, I think, is a huge damper. And if they're 10-2, they probably still make the playoff. But I don't know if their schedule is going to do them a whole lot of favors to make that happen either, because they don't have a lot of marquee
They have to go on the road to LSU in a couple of weeks. It's going to be another tough one as well.
If they're 10-2, well, actually, no. If it's 10-2, they need LSU to probably finish as a top 15 type team, because if their losses are big to Georgia and then to Kentucky, I don't think that puts them in a very good position. So I'm going to vote to take them out right now.
Yeah, I agree. They are probably, I wouldn't say they're the easiest choice. There's actually 2 pretty slam dunk choices to remove right at this point. We'll get to the next one in a second. But yeah, I think at this point, they can certainly play them their way back in. And again, Kentucky can have figured it out and go on their own run to also kind of bolster the resume for Ole Miss. But at this point, it's a safe bet to take them off. That's an easy one. All right. So next up, and this is one where, again, I'm fairly certain we're going to be confident that this is a time to remove it, but it's also fitting into a bigger picture in the offseason that we painted a picture, and now it's actually happening, and people seem like, oh my gosh, the Big 12 is chaos, and Utah suffered just an embarrassing loss at home to Arizona, a team that had just also lost. Now, at the same time, going into this season, we were like, well, it's hard to pick anyone to win the Big 12. The easy pick is a Utah, but Arizona or, Kansas State or Oklahoma State, and then, Iowa State, I know is one you've been big on, could easily be a game there. Now, the only thing that's changed is the other team that we were talking about was Kansas. They've somehow swapped with BYU in this conversation, to the surprise of everyone. But I think losing Arizona at home, I've talked to people who were at that game, And they said the vibe in the stadium was really weird because no one expected to lose. They even said like, oh, we do this thing at third down where we all yell and scream, and people were kind of half-hearted because it was just Arizona. Utah was going to roll, And then by the fourth quarter, suddenly everyone realized, oh, they don't have a good secondary, or at least their secondary has been a weak spot, and Arizona was completely exploiting it. What did you make of that game?
Yeah, I mean, it was a messy game for Utah in so many ways. And I think that you could make a decent case that for a lot of the game that Utah was outplaying Arizona, but it was actually some of these game management stuff that I think that Utah did really poorly. Of course, they still had Isaac Wilson back there at quarterback, and it felt like Arizona was like, we're gonna like not necessarily stack the box, but we're gonna play the run more and really try to take that away and make Isaac Wilson go downfield and beat us. And Dorian Singer was able to make stuff happen at receiver for them. But I mean, this is what you expect from a freshman quarterback. 2 interceptions in that game. They have to find a way to get Cameron Rising back. Like, he's been cleared to play football, but like what it sounds like, and nobody knows anything for certain, but what it sounds like is that he's got cuts that required stitches on his middle 2 fingers, so he just doesn't have his full grip strength at this point. You got to figure it out. Like I'm sorry, you got to figure it out because it's less. I think you take a trade-off of velocity throwing the ball for better decision making. Isaac Wilson turned the ball over twice in this game, in a game where Utah only scores 10 points. And I think that, when you look at Utah defensively, like they just started to wear down by the end of the game. And Arizona just had more consistent playmakers led, of course, by their quarterback. And so this is the issue of the Big 12 is that if you are not on your A game, anything can happen. And we saw that 2 weeks ago when Utah goes on the road and beats Oklahoma State pretty good, and then they come back and lose by 2 touchdowns at home to Arizona. I will say, if you ask me today, I still think that Utah's a team that will win the Big 12 and make the college football playoff. But there are 2 teams who maybe we can talk about right now that are both on Utah's schedule. And if they don't at least split them, I don't know how they're going to make it to Arlington.
I just want to add one thing to the chaos of this, just to point out, Arizona had a bye week. They had actually lost to Kansas State in their previous game. And meanwhile, Kansas State, of course, had lost to BYU and then went and became the second loss for Oklahoma State. So it's been absolutely fascinating to watch this dynamic kind of play out here. But yeah, so we're going to have to replace Utah. Because I think we're unanimous on Utah. You're out for now. You have an opportunity down the road because, as you pointed out, the Holy War is going to be interesting against BYU, especially if BYU hangs on the way they are and manages to keep on winning games. And again, they get Iowa State a little bit later, as well as Colorado, who's also, we may not put them in the conversation now, but Colorado, we're keeping an eye on you because that UCF game was way different than a lot of folks thought it was going to go. But in terms of candidates, Iowa State, BYU, and maybe even Kansas State has played their way back in by taking down Oklahoma State right after that, a loss against a BYU team that we now which is now ranked, which it hadn't been. Which of those 3 do you think has the best position now to be a banner winner, or at least the leader in the clubhouse for the Big 12?
Well, look, there are 2 teams that are undefeated, and then there's Kansas State, and so I'm going to put Kansas State to the side a little bit. I think that they need to continue to earn their way back. It's been no secret to me, right, or to anybody, who my probably most favorite team coming into the year was, and that was Iowa State. And they have looked the part to this point. Last week, a little bit of a slow start, but they ultimately beat Houston 20-0 in a game that was nowhere near that close.
Yeah,
they,
of course, 3-0, folks, in the third quarter. I was watching that game when I saw that score. I'm like, okay. But hey, your man, Abu Sama, he busted that game open.
Yep. He was like, and again, it was just one of those games where it's like, Houston's not going to score. Houston is being drowned underwater by Iowa State's defense, and ultimately Iowa State's offense, which is something that I said, right? Is like, I felt like this Iowa State offense has an explosive component at different levels that I don't feel like they've had in previous years. The last time, especially at the wide receiver position, that I felt like they had multiple to lean on was probably Alan Lazard and Hakeem Butler, which was back in 2018. They have that with Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel. Of course, they have the win on the road against Iowa where they come back. The other thing that you have to like too is their path is very manageable in terms of, obviously it's a Big 12 schedule. You can lose any game along the way because everybody is pretty close, but they don't play a ranked opponent until the second to last week of the season. They finish at Utah versus Kansas State. I think that really both of those games, but I think that especially that game, Farmageddon against Kansas State, will be a Big 12 title game, play-in game. That's my personal opinion right now. I think that ultimately will happen. So I lean that direction. I lean Iowa State. Now, to touch on BYU for a second, I mean, they have been one of the surprise teams in all of college football to this point. And again, like they've done it against solid teams. Like SMU has started to figure things out a little bit. BYU still beat them. Kansas State, of course, BYU causes a lot of issues for them. And this has been a team that's been led by its defense and done enough on offense to get by. They've managed games well. They've not turned the ball over. They've forced turnovers the other direction. There's some things about this team, and probably the reason that I lean Iowa State is just because I think that BYU is doing some stuff that's a little less sustainable to me. Like if you look, I mean, like their yards per play, their yards, like stuff like that, like some of the underlying metrics are a little concerning to me in terms of making it through at 11-1 or whatever, but also their resume is as good as anybody with the wins over SMU and Kansas State. So I do think that they deserve to seriously be considered, but I lean Iowa State. That's my vote.
Yeah, I'm going to go with you on that one. I think that this is they have heading into this season. We were more confident in what who they had. I mean, BYU. I remember in our preseason, and even their own beat writer was having some trouble placing them anywhere, just because it was a lot of uncertain, especially after a kind of a very lackluster start to being a member of the Big 12 in the previous season. I think certainly they can play their way in, but it's still at this point it feels like, gosh, the classic, like a couple of seasons in a row, it seemed like Syracuse would just start a season undefeated, and then the reality would set in. Iowa State had that happen back in the day. I still remember when Seneca Wallace was their quarterback, and they started out like undefeated, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, Iowa State's actually legitimate." No, they actually finished the season 6-7. But sometimes those things happen. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen in BYU, and I just got to say, I kind of like when BYU does well because their fans are pretty awesome people, especially. I mean, I don't know if you guys, I just want to go back, but when Kansas State was playing them, Avery Johnson has this charitable thing to benefit his principal, who is his old high school principal has cancer. So every time Kansas State would score a touchdown, there would be a donation in his name. Well, they only scored 3 field goals. So the BYU fans heard that on the broadcast and donated like $40,000. So again, I love the fan base. I love you guys. But setting you all aside, I think Iowa State right now gets the edge. I do have to say, though, it's funny because there's a series of bye weeks that happen to some key teams in the Big 12. So this weekend isn't that exciting for the Big 12. I mean, Iowa State plays your Baylor team. So that should, and Baylor's had, they nearly actually knocked BYU out of the conversation this week, but
they suck. We don't have to acknowledge that.
But so we get a bye week for a lot of teams. And then Colorado and Kansas State both have byes. And then we get a game in Boulder that could be interesting because the winner of that game, 2 1-loss teams in the Big 12, I'm going to be very curious because that's going to be where I think if Kansas pulls that one off, we're going to hear a lot more about the bus. People are going to be like, oh, wow, wait, no, Dion may actually have this. We're getting those rumbles now, but suddenly Colorado, I think, will be much, much bigger of a factor in the Big 12 picture. And again, Arizona, they I believe play Texas Tech, I want to say this week, but BYU has a bye week as well before they play the Wildcats. And that'll also be another interesting game where we'll get the benchmarking Wildcat against Cougar to see which cat is more of a superior breed here in the Big 12. But all right, so I think that's it. We'll put Iowa State in to replace Utah. I think that's a safe bet. Now, one other team I want to mention that we haven't discussed because they did lose is Georgia in what was just a remarkable game, a near comeback that seemed improbable after Alabama. I mean, because we had the whole conversation. I mean, just to reiterate, last week, if you were listening to our Wednesday show, we had our Wednesday recorded episode. We had a conversation with the top coaches, and then here we have. Actually, that might have been the earlier week show, but we were talking about Kalen DeBoer versus Kirby Smart. What did you make of that game? I mean, and it's fascinating too. We saw the playmakers, and both teams had tremendous playmakers. I mean, oh, he's only 17. We got that. But going back to the earlier conversation, what did it tell you about the coaching?
Well, I've been as loud as anybody that I feel like Kalen DeBoer has a case as the number 2 coach in all of college football. And after this game, Kalen DeBoer, as specifically a power conference coach, this is not including his awesome record in NAIA, is 30-3 with a 6-0 combined record against Steve Sarkisian, Kirby Smart, and Dan Lanning. That's pretty good, man. Like, and cool. At Alabama, you have as much talent as everybody, whatever. 5 of those 6 wins came with a much less quote unquote talented team than what Oregon or Texas were running out there. So, like, I was very optimistic about what Alabama could be under Kalen DeBoer. And I love that we got to have our conversation last week with Matt Stahl over at AL.com. And I think a lot of what he said came true, right? Like, this is a team that not only has maintained the Alabama standard, but has actually grown in a lot of ways. I picked Jalen Milroe as my preseason Heisman favorite because I thought that he would have a chance to develop in this offense. That's happened. I did not think that Ryan Williams was going to be this good this quickly at wide receiver, but the other piece too is, again, like, it's funny to think about because Nick Saban, greatest coach in the history of football, but, like, this team looks more Saban-y and more Alabama-y, especially on defense, than any team that I feel like we've seen since 2020. The thing that I loved, and look, Georgia adjusted, Carson Beck came back. In the first half, the number of different looks that Alabama's defense and secondary gave Georgia was insane. Like, they just kept, like, simulating pressure. They kept moving into different formations. Like, it was like, even watching on the television broadcast, you could see, like, you're just like, what the hell is going on? Like I couldn't even track what was going on. And I'm watching on the television broadcast, and Carson Beck, obviously, for the first half of that game was in hell. Like, he had no idea what was going on. And, it's hard to keep that kind of play up for a full game, but I think that speaks to this coaching staff and what they've been able to install and instill in very, very, very short order. So, look, obviously Georgia almost came back, and, like, so we're in no rush to kick Georgia out for losing a game against Alabama by 7 points. But I do think Alabama's a better team. Like, I do think that it's not just, oh, well, they got a 75-yard touchdown at the end. I think that for 60 minutes, they were the better team. They are the better quality team. I would vote for them ahead of Georgia right now, even if we were to play this game over again. Like, this is a really good Alabama team. And I think that, to touch on Georgia for a second, I am not concerned. I want to be clear. I'm not concerned. I don't know that they have great pass catchers. Dominic Lovett is a very good pass catcher, but, like, we're talking about, like, the Brock Bowers and Lad McConkeys being such a big part of what they did. George Pickens, of course, his big catch in the national championship game. I don't know that they have those guys at receiver and tight end the same way. They tried to build it back up with Benjamin Yurachek coming over from Stanford at tight end, Oscar Delp, Lovett, like I mentioned, London Humphreys being a factor, but, like, they just haven't had those guys step up into being Ryan Williams or Jeremiah Smith or Isaiah Bond. And I do think that obviously quarterback's a thing of its own. I think that also interior defensive linemen are a thing of its own. You could make the case that wide receiver is relative to normal. Like, in this moment, I think that having great wide receivers is as valuable as anything in college football right now. And I just don't think that Georgia has it right now. And so when you talk about them versus the Ohio State, Alabama, Texas tier, which I think is the top tier right now, I probably moved Georgia down about half a step compared to where I would have had them even just a couple days ago.
Yeah, one of the only critique I thought had some merit about the Alabama performance is Kalen DeBoer historically has had teams come back in the second half on them, and I don't know if it's in it. Clearly, of course, with someone like Kirby Smart and company, they're also making very good adjustments typically on their side of the ball. But I do wonder that if that might come back to haunt them if Alabama does perhaps not have the killer instinct. Then it's not enough just to beat them; we have to destroy them, which they certainly did in the first half. But Alabama,
They did
Georgia.
on the most important drive of the game too.
They did. They absolutely did. But I'm a little nervous. That's only and no, actually, I should say this. That is like literally me reaching for a critique of that performance. I will fully admit that.
See, Nick Saban was like, the way that we're going to demoralize you is by coming out and dragging you into the dirt. And maybe Kalen DeBoer is like, you know how I'm really going to destroy you? I'm going to destroy you, and then I'm going to make you think you have a chance. And then I'm going to break your neck.
Hope is where they
because
get you.
He did that over and over and over again at the University of Washington. And guess what? He kept winning all those games.
Yeah, hope is where they get you. That's the best. I love that. We should probably we're keeping Georgia in unanimously.
Yes,
I don't think there's any
Georgia
question
in.
they are 100% still a playoff caliber team. We just can't legitimize that loss as a reason to remove them. But one more team I just want to lightly touch on. Miami. Yes, they won, but they won in a game a lot of people watched that had a really kind of controversial ending, hosting Virginia Tech, which a team that had been a preseason dark horse favorite for the ACC, but they stumbled. But they nearly took down the Hurricanes, and those are teams that have had their own history, a whole lot of history between them, especially going all the way back to the Big East. But what did we make of that game? Is that enough? Are we concerned about Miami enough to say, maybe they shouldn't be a part of our survivor pool?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question, right? We have another ACC team in there right now, so it's not like we need to have them in there. I think that I'm willing to give them kind of a mulligan. Like, I think I'm willing to say, hey, that was weird. Don't do that again. but head into that next little group, still having them in the group. Now, I will say, when you look back at their schedule in the context of this Virginia Tech game, I mean, South Florida's a good team, of course, but South Florida gave them trouble for a half. Florida looks terrible. Ball State's not good. Florida A&M isn't all that impressive. So, like, you can start to pick apart the schedule just a little bit, especially after what happened against Virginia Tech, who is a team that I think will be, a top half ACC contender, potentially, maybe a little bit better than that. I think they're starting to figure some things out. I actually think that we're going to learn, and Miami's not going to lose this game most likely, but I do think we're going to learn a little bit more, kind of like what we were talking about with Ole Miss when they play Oklahoma. But I think we're going to learn a little bit about Miami when they go on the road to play Cal this week, because Cal is a really physical defense. They can cause issues for teams. If Miami handles that well and comes out and plays just at the top of their game, this is the college game day game. It's going to, a lot of people are going to be watching. If they come out and look really good and just handle business, I'll feel a lot better. If they have another performance, not even a loss, if they have another really tight one-score game against Cal this upcoming week, I think we'll have to think about kicking them out next week.
Oh, but that'll be the Calgorithm. It'll be because of the Calgorithm. But we'll talk a little bit about that game in the second half of this show. But I just one last thought, because we have now eliminated. We actually only have 11 teams in our pool because Ole Miss has not been swapped with anybody. Do we want to consider another team? And we don't need to go into too much depth with all of them, but some potential replacements are actually, frankly, any of those Big 12 teams we just discussed, but also Oregon, USC, which defeated Wisconsin, of course. Michigan, which had their own close shave against Minnesota, which was unexpected, and a whole other conversation there. And then Notre Dame, which has continued to win ever since that inexplicable loss to more and more inexplicable loss to NIU. Do we see any potential candidates there to consider joining our survivor pool?
I think that I'm about ready to put Oregon back in, right? Like, I think that their win against Boise State is aging pretty well. The thing that probably gives me more confidence is their offense and their offensive line have just they're good now. They're good. They're out of trouble zone. Like, that was obviously a huge issue for them through the first 2 weeks of the year. But I think that they found some stuff that really works for them. They ran for 153 yards last week against UCLA. I know through the first half of the UCLA game, I'm trying to remember what the graphic was, but they put a graphic on the screen that they had scored on 13 straight drives, I think it was, between Oregon State, the end of the Boise State game, and the first half of the UCLA game. So I feel pretty good that this team has figured it out, that they're going to be okay, that they're starting to become what we are. Now, look, we had Oregon number 3 in the country coming into the year, ahead of Texas and Alabama. They have to do a little more, of course, especially when it comes to that October 12th game against Ohio State to make that happen. But I do think that it's fair to put them back in. They are a truly legitimate college football playoff contender. As long as, well, I will say that we do have to mention one more team. Are you ready for Indiana or not yet?
Indiana, like they can do it. I'm not, obviously any team can play. We will accept anyone who's got the great resume. But yeah, Indiana, I am delighted. I cannot wait to see where you're going. But at this point, well, I'm gonna keep you on the table. I think Oregon's got a better resume now, especially because Boise State has ended up being quite good. That's the other thing.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
Boise State, that the Idaho team game at the beginning was just a weird game altogether, and Idaho, of course, went on to upset Wyoming, arguably a quote unquote upset another FBS team on the road.
Statistically, it was an upset.
Yeah,
that's
but what I just want to ask though, they're going to have a Friday night game in Autzen this week, and it isn't. And Friday night means more likely people will see it. It's not necessarily a game that'll be buried. They've got Michigan State heading into Autzen now. Again, Jonathan Smith is, he's played in Autzen before. What are you going to be looking for the Ducks to do against a team that is at least probably a step up than UCLA?
Well, I think for me right now, it's kind of what they did last week against UCLA, right? Like, I want to see them be consistent offensively. That was their struggle early in the season. And Michigan State is like, they're not good, but they're not a bad team either. They beat Maryland early in the year. They were within 4 points of Boston College. Even Ohio State, like, it took a little bit of time for Ohio State to pull away in that game against them. Like, it was 3-0 through one quarter. And then kind of at the end, Jeremiah Smith happened, and things happen when Jeremiah Smith happens. But I do think that if they're able to come out, have really consistent offensive drives, run the ball at a high level, I think it's going to be a huge part of it for me. And win by 24 without breaking too much of a sweat. I think I'd feel pretty good about that.
I want to see them now win by 23 so we can put them on the block next week. Like,
You're out of here. You're out of here. You're not a contender heading into your game against Ohio State.
It was 26-3. We better have a conversation, All right. Well, let's see here. When we get back from our break, we're going to take a quick look at some of these upcoming games that we've talked about here on the College Football Survivor Show. Just a quick breakdown just before I forget. So we are keeping, these aren't ranked in a particular order, but our current Survivor pool, Georgia remains, Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, Penn State. Now we've got Iowa State, Miami, Clemson, Missouri, Tennessee, Oregon, and our current G5 team is Boise State. So that's who we've got. And when we come back from this break, we're going to talk about some of these upcoming games here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so I know we've had a chance to chat about a couple of these games, as well as some other games in the periphery. And again, while there is only one ranked on ranked game, and I want to say barely, because for those who don't know, the AP Top 20, it's an AP Top 26 this week, because there was a tie for the number 25. And this actually messed up the system, because usually when there's a tie, you skip a number. And then, it might go from number 23 to number 25. But because number 25 was tied, you actually have to include them both. And the AP website has never been asked to do that. And I love the AP website, but their top 25 page is hilariously.
I have to ask, so who are we supposed to yell at now that Ralph Russo is moving over to The Athletic?
I don't know. And I always feel bad for Ralph, because it's not like he's a computer guy. It's like they handed him the system, he enters the data, and it would always somehow lack a logo. Or I still remember the year where Louisiana, Lafayette got included. So the computer put the Lafayette the leopards, like the FCS school logo in their place.
I love it.
It keeps screwing up. One year they actually had the Michigan State logo somehow get replaced. We looked it up. They found a team in Canada, then found a Spartan logo from there. Anyway, all that said, they didn't include Texas A&M. So when the list came out, it was so confusing. People were like, where's 4-1 Texas A&M? They were ranked 23 last year, and they're not even in other receiving votes or the top 25. But all that said, I can tell you that's one thing Ralph isn't going to miss now that he's left the AP to join the Athletic. And he's a great guy, for the record. We both like him a lot. But
we love him. I will say, so The rankings this year, just in general, have been really interesting to me. I think when we headed into the year, like we didn't know a lot about a lot of these teams, and there was so much defaulting to brands and that sort of thing. Actually, people are always like, "Oh, we need to get rid of the early season rankings. We shouldn't rank." But like my thing is, I actually think that would make us defer more to brands. Like I think anyway. I don't know, but I think that like for me, I don't know why Texas A&M still ranked. Like I don't really get it. This feels so like inertia to me. Like it feels like, well, they were ranked before. What are we gonna do? Drop them out? It's like, well, because they like beat Arkansas by 4 points. Like I just the most impressive thing that they've done is pick up a transitive loss to Northern Illinois. And I want to be clear, like I think Texas A&M is pretty good and has a chance to be pretty good. Heck, they might win this weekend against Missouri, but like it just feels like we're just doing stuff whenever we have a team like Texas A&M in the poll. And by the way, tied with UNLV, who has clearly been better than them to this point.
And the funny thing is, like, are we disrespecting the hallowed Southwest Classic? But which I believe is now that was the final year of it. They're no longer going to do it at Jerry World. It's going to be it's going to rotate now between the home campuses. But yeah, I agree. It's you lose to Notre Dame, which again, as you pointed out, the transitive loss to NIU. You got wins against McNeese, at Florida, Bowling Green, not exactly a murderer's row, and Bowling Green, which gave trouble to Penn State, also gave some serious trouble to Texas A&M. So again, it's remarkable to me that they've managed to even stay in the top 25 when it's not like they were ranked high. I mean, they were 20 there. I love it. They actually went up a rank after they nearly lost, after they had that close game against Bowling Green. That's the best part. They went up to 24. I don't get it. But they're still, that is the only ranked matchup we have this week. But before we get to that, well, actually, let's start with that one. Do you think Mizzou is going to then put this to bed, or do you think, because Mizzou has been the seat of their pants team this season, where they're winning, but every game it's like they're raising the blood pressure. Do you think Mizzou will be able to take care of that defense and put some points on the board and really kind of put them away?
It's a good question. I do think that Missouri deserves to be favored in this game, which I've seen a lot of numbers that have Texas A&M favored. I don't really necessarily think that deserves to be the case, but this is going to be a big test. This is a big test. I think that Missouri to this point has, like you kind of said, skated by in a lot of these games. They haven't, I don't think, figured out sort of their second wind in the passing game, right? They kind of really focus in on Theo Weiss and Luther Burden. I want to see them get a little bit more diverse there, but it's also one of those things where you're just like, how much of it is trouble and how much of it is they didn't plan to need their full playbook against Vanderbilt, a couple weeks ago, right? That they didn't plan to need everything against Boston College. So, I mean, this obviously is a team that's so similar to the one that had an 11-win season in 2023. And I do think that as the season goes along, they're going to continue to get better. But it's an interesting matchup. I mean, Texas A&M's secondary has been a little more inconsistent than you'd expect for a Mike Elko coach team, and their offense also. Again, you've seen the flashes, but you haven't seen consistency from it. So I think this could be a little bit of a lower scoring game, but I do think that Missouri is going to be the team that ultimately makes the right plays at the end.
I do have to say Boston College and Mizzou's game was very appropriate because if people have been paying attention to BC, they've had two other nail biters since that. They barely beat Michigan State, and 1 point win against a Western Kentucky team that, of course, took, to their credit, they also took another G5 team out of the conversation. Who did they beat 2 weeks ago? I'm trying to remember. Who was the team that walked into Western Kentucky and walked out with a loss?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I should have this right in front of me. Sorry about that, everyone. Here I cite that, and it was
Toledo.
Toledo. Yeah, gosh. Toledo, potential future member of the Mountain West. No, probably not, but that was still one of my favorite things in this past week. Anyway, okay, so let's move to another game we should focus on, only because Ohio State, number 3 in the nation, is finally playing a team with a pulse, and that is Iowa, which works. I mean, because Iowa, again, their only loss is a 1-point loss to Iowa State, a team we just put in our survivor pool. As we've said, the Cyhawk game is always chaos, always ugly. And I believe you were actually thinking the Cyclones were going to pull that one off, and they certainly did. But since then, they've done well. They beat Troy, they beat their rivals, the Gophers here in Minneapolis. Are they going to be? How are we going to? Because everyone wants to look ahead. Because then next weekend they're going to get the game in Autzen. That's the one that people have circled as a real true test for both of those teams. But how much can we get from watching how the Hawkeyes do in Columbus?
Yeah, I think it's a big game for both teams. And, again, like the reality is when we only have a handful of like truly best on best teams, like it is unit on unit in so many ways. And I think that when I look at Iowa, this has been a team that's top 5 nationally in run defense, right? They're holding opponents to under 62 yards per game. And Ohio State, for all the talk about, Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, Will Howard, they have been a team that's leaned on running the ball with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. So I think this will be a great test for Ohio State's offensive line, which was kind of their big question mark coming into the season. They've handled themselves admirably to this point, but it's going to be another test. I think it will also be a great test for Jeremiah Smith, who through the first couple games of the year has been as electric as any player in all of college football. But their biggest test was Michigan State. Like, this is a different level, of course, going against an Iowa secondary that consistently is one of the best in the country. So I think that that'll be a really interesting matchup to watch. I'll also be curious to see from Iowa. Quietly, this has been a team that actually has been pretty improved offensively under Tim Lester. And a lot of it goes to their running back, Caleb Johnson, who's been one of the best in the country to this point. But I want to see them diversify a little bit and see whether they're able to make some stuff happen against this Ohio State defense. I have no doubt that Ohio State's going to be the team that wins the game, and probably by multiple scores. But if I was able to keep it close well into the second half, well into the fourth quarter, I think that speaks really highly of what this team is putting together.
Yeah, and we've talked about it again before the season, but the two Big Ten teams with the weakest schedules are Rutgers and Iowa. This is their hardest game. The next games are not. I'm not going to say they have a total gimme. Maybe at UCLA, because it seems like the Bruins really have lost the plot. But they
shocker.
This is it. Yeah, real shocker there. Hey, they are in Los Angeles. I love UCLA, even though I grew up with them as a rival. Just the whole story there is great.
Yeah, it more just sucks for them just all of this, frankly.
Yeah, they're the one team that is at the new edition that is getting the burden of all the struggle. Yes. Everyone thought, USC will struggle. It ends up that UCLA just got extra struggle shipped to them from actually taken away from them, because that's why Danton Lynn is now in the USC. So
all the good vibes got transmitted to Cal.
Exactly. Oh my goodness. Well, and speaking of Cal, the other game we wanted to talk about was the game day game. So we get the Hurricanes heading over to the ACC grounds of Berkeley, California. They're not going to be playing in People's Park, which is still a fortress, which is a whole long story, but they're going to be going into Strawberry Canyon to play. They're going to have Tightwad Hill over. I can't wait to see this game. I love the jokes. I love the Calgorithm, the woke versus Coke, all of that stuff. But what are we going to be looking for here, especially after that game against Virginia Tech?
Well, I think for me, again, it's just consistency. That's what I need to see from Miami, especially on the offensive side of the ball. We know that the big plays can happen. We've seen it. I think that one of the things that concerned me the most about Miami's performance against Virginia Tech is we started to see a little bit of late season Washington State Cam Ward, which is when he just loses faith in his teammates and starts trying to freelance a little bit. Through the first couple games of the year, I think he did a tremendous job, and especially that Florida game, of staying in control and just letting the game come to him. But when you look at his 3 turnovers in the first half and the first drive of the second half, it was a lot of him trying to do too much, and he doesn't need to do too much on this team, frankly. So I do think that ultimately I want to see them continue to be consistent, not turn the ball over. And Cal, I think, is a pretty good defense to do that against. They're very physical. They love to end drives. They love to have good field position. They're pretty good against the run. It'll be a great test for Damian Martinez. I think also a big part of it too, bigger than the players, is Miami needs to not abandon the run in this game. That was something that I felt like happened a lot in their early game against Virginia Tech. They just started tossing the ball around, and look, it's easy to do, right? All of us have NCAA 25, and ain't nobody handing the ball to Damian Martinez when you got Cam Ward in the backfield. But Shannon Dawson, I think, needs to balance things out just a little bit more, especially early in games. So, again, it's a game that I expect that Miami's going to win, but I think that their process on offense, especially, I want to see a little bit more consistency.
I almost want to see the over under on the number of cards that are thrown on the field during the game. Because the last time Cal had a home game, boy, oh boy, some of you may not have seen it, but I actually, again, I was up watching the game, and suddenly I was in the background, but I just heard Justin Wilcox hop on a mic. So he grabbed the ref's mic to tell the fans to stop throwing. Because for those who don't know, the card stunt, where a bunch of people have cards, you hold them up and you create a big picture. You all have seen it, you may not have just known it's called that, was invented at Cal for the rivalry with Stanford in the big game. So they've done it every game, but then they spent all week trying to talk people to come to the San Diego State game. People show up, and then they start taking these cards and chucking them on the field and getting Cal 2 personal fouls, like 2 15-yard penalties from the audience. So let me be clear. You too can make an influence in your favorite games if you just have the right determination, but don't do it. Please don't do it. But oh my goodness. So I'm really looking forward to how unhinged this game could accidentally go for any number of reasons, only because it's Cal and the attention's on them. And now that with the spotlight on Cal this season, even with that Florida State loss, what we're seeing them do is absolutely bizarre as just a cultural kind of a group. And I'm loving it. I did not know Pac-12 fans did not appreciate the football culture as such at the Cal Berkeley until they left, and then they got out of the spotlight's on them. They were totally into the shadows of all the other schools. Now they get to be themselves. But yeah, I think Miami's going to probably win, but it's going to be an interesting one. I'm glad it's a late night game. It's going to be an opportunity for people to see it. I believe it's a 10:30 p.m. Eastern kickoff, which obviously is not that late here or out there on the West Coast. But we're going to be staying up late in Berkeley watching ACC after dark, potentially put one on there for the Hurricanes. One other game we wanted to discuss for sure, and we touched on it lightly. UNLV, newly minted number 25, second week ranked in the coaches poll. They get Syracuse. Heading into Vegas, heading into Allegiant, the better of the two stadiums. How many times does a G5 team get to say, like, no, we'll play at our house? But what do you make of this game? What should we look for?
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting game. Of course, Kyle McCord has slowed down a little bit from his blazing early season start, but this is still a really good Syracuse team, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Their only loss, a 2-point loss against Stanford that came down to the very end, but 42 points against Holy Cross, 31 against Georgia Tech, 38 against Ohio. UNLV, though, like, they are a team that is just more than happy to hold on to the ball and not let it go, especially with Haj Malik Williams at quarterback. And the funny thing about it is, UNLV, of course, with Matthew Sluka, was so dynamic running the ball with the quarterback, but like they just add a whole nother component with some of this intermediate passing game stuff that Haj Malik Williams brought to the table. And the thing is, everybody saw the final score last week, 59-14 against Fresno State. But Fresno State's actually like a pretty good team. They're like a legitimate Mountain West contender. And if you want a comparison, UNLV beat them 59-14. Michigan beat Fresno State 30-10 in a game that was even closer than that into the fourth quarter. So like, this UNLV team might just be really, really, really good. And we mentioned it earlier. If UNLV wins this game, then they'll be 3-0 against power conference opponents, Kansas, Houston, and Syracuse. They beat Houston 27-7. They have the 59-14 win over Fresno State. We've talked about it, right? Like, it's hard. Like, the reality is, like, all the group of 5 teams are fighting for one spot for most likely. If UNLV absolutely rolls through this game, I feel like we have to at least talk about them for one of the at-large spots in our fields come next week.
There's some very interesting scenarios on the horizon that I started to think about this week. I mean, first of all, I just again want to credit that UNLV defense. They had 2 great picks on Mikey Keene in that game. And And every time I tune in, they were getting an interception. And we talked about that. Their defense was something that was getting lost even in the preseason, talking about this particular UNLV team. But with these two rising teams in the Mountain West, and they're going to play in the regular season, and then potentially play again at the end of the season. But we also have the side story of what's going on in the American, and who knows? You got Army and Navy undefeated. What if one of them does go on a bit of a run? What if? And the thing I'm going to bring up is, meanwhile, there's two scenarios here that I've been curious that are outlandish on paper, but could happen. The less likely is, could we potentially end up with two conference champs from the ACC, not being part of the 5 seed? I'm not saying being top of those first 4 seeds in the 5th. I'm saying, could we see another potential G5 team work their way up if enough chaos happens? I doubt that. But could we see one of these G5 champs? Let's say UNLV does run the table. Like, would they potentially be ranked higher at one point than, let's say, a very clobbered, maybe 3-loss Big 12 team? Could we see them accidentally get not accidentally, but earn their 4 seed? Could they end up, being ranked like, let's say 12th, but somehow, because we end up with a conference champ? Because we've seen that happen. We've talked about it. On paper, Cincinnati would have been that team several years ago. They would have been the one to have climbed up and actually been one of those 4 seeds. Could we see that? And I mean, this is, again, a lot of stuff has to go the right way. And this doesn't feel like the Cincinnati team that we were like, oh, this is going to be the team. This is going to be the year. But could they be the surprise?
I think it's very much possible. Again, like, this early season run for the Big 12 has kind of gone like the weirdest way possible. You look at the top contenders, Kansas State and Utah, both already have losses. A bunch of these teams still have to play each other. It's definitely on the table that UNLV, if they go through, would have a chance. And I mean, look, I'm not counting Kansas as being dead as yet in the Big 12 race, and they have a head-to-head over Kansas, of course. They have a 27-7 win over Houston. And when we talk about even the way that the committee process works, they pay attention to things like mutual opponents and mutual games and how those games went. I mean, they kind of have put together a really nice situation. And again, I think that makes even more, that puts even more focus also on the Syracuse game, where you might be fighting against an ACC champion or a second ACC team potentially. So it's on the table. I think that UNLV is probably the only team in the group of 5 that could do it right now. I don't know that Boise State necessarily could, unless they crush UNLV twice. That would probably be the only way that they could get close to being in that buy range, but it's certainly possible. And I will say, somebody with a Big 12 background, like, I would advise the Big 12 to try to avoid that happening, because I think that would be real bad for them. But I do think that when you look at what UNLV is putting together, like, it's all on the table. It's all right there.
You have to admit, though, the idea of the Big 12 champion reward is you get to go play a road game at Texas would be hilarious. That would be although the oh my gosh, the storylines that would be for Texas hosting the Big 12 champ, like, oh, yeah, the conference they just left. Oh my gosh, like, oh, I'll be honest, that'll be must-watch. That'll suddenly be a must-watch TV game, and I hope that's the one they put up against the NFL, because that would be really interesting. Anyway. Oh, I can't wait. I mean, even though, again, one ranked unranked team, but that some chaos is going to happen this week. It just seems inevitable. We don't know what game it's going to be. We didn't go through every game, obviously. There's going to be a game out there that we're going to be probably talking about pretty seriously next week here on the College Football Survivor Show. So on that note, let's just wrap this up. I want to thank all of you for listening. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Tell your friends. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work on CBSSports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hyrie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.